Our last presenter, but certainly not least, is Professor Susan Erickson from Art History, Literature, Philosophy, and Arts Department. And she is going to present on Berthold Laufer in Xian, China. Or is it Xian? I had it right the first time, okay. I don't know if it's on automatic. We will play it by ear. I think it's on automatic.
My presentation focuses on Berthold Laufer, who trained in Asian languages and religion in Berlin and Leipzig, and his efforts to build a collection of Chinese artifacts for the American Museum of Natural History. I will examine his methods of collecting and also the fate of the collection. He arrived in the US at the invitation of Franz Boas, first to join an expedition to the North Pacific and then to make a solo trip to China, the Schiff expedition. Both men were interested in making a collection of Chinese artifacts and also in establishing sinology as a field of study in New York. Letters exchanged between the men are preserved at the museum. Boas wrote about the goal was to, quote, bring home to the public the fact that the Chinese have a civilization of their own and to inculcate respect for the Chinese, unquote. Laufer acquired a wide range of artifacts to document contemporary life in China, even making wax cylinder recordings of dialects and songs. But the letters also reveal that Laufer had a growing interest in collecting antiquities in order to document the ancient civilization of China. And he convinced Boas that he must go to Xian to acquire and possibly excavate ancient artifacts. Laufer had spent most of his time in the east coast of China with Shanghai as a base, and also made a trip to Beijing. A trip to Xian required an arduous 24-day trip, and you better like riding a mule. Of course, he knew that the importance of Xian, a city that had served as capital on and off since the 12th century BCE. He immediately started purchasing objects, unlike anything he collected elsewhere. During his 7-week stay, he acquired over 300 objects, primarily falling into the category of art and archaeological objects, like bronze vessels and pottery from the Han Dynasty. Laufer's field notebook from the trip has survived, and we can learn much about his objectives and strategies. It is likely he filled it out day by day as he collected. And here, for an ancient vessel, he noted he was told it was dug up, likely unearthed by a farmer, and this was important to Laufer in terms of thinking about find spot. In the same entry, he recorded the title of a 19th century book and a specific entry revealing he wanted to identify the precise ancient nomenclature for the object. In letters to Boas, he stated that he carried several satchels of books with him when traveling, and he also was purchasing books for the museum and for Columbia. Laufer's book collection is preserved in the museum. He was guided in many cases by illustrations of early 19th century private collections and even earlier collections, as well as classical texts. He wrote in the margins as he translated, and many of his handwritten notes are still in the books. In another entry, he recorded the name of a shop in Xian and also an evaluation of the bronze ritual vessel by a man named Su, who said this vessel looks like it dates to the 10th century BCE, but it should be dated to the 17th or 18th century CE. Su is mentioned many times in the field notes. He offered his opinion regarding inscriptions, dates, and correct names of objects. Su also sold him many things too. Only in later articles did Laufer indicate that Su was Muslim and that his family had been in the antiquarian business for several generations. In this entry, Laufer recorded another example of an archaistic type, that is, an 11th century CE vessel imitating a 10th century BCE type. He may not have known that Xian was actually a place where bronze continued to be cast well into the late 19th century. and that they could be made to fool the buyer with the addition of false patinas. One source for forgers was book illustrations, and it seems to me that this very odd vessel with 100 rings likely was based on a picture in a book documenting the collection of an emperor, who also was misled about it being an ancient type. So Laufer acquired a copy of a fake. One of the other types of objects that Laufer sought to collect was pottery like this. Today, museums are filled with such objects, but in this period, very few were interested in them since they were funerary wares, considered inauspicious to have in one's home. He only collected about 45 examples, and the range of type was very narrow. Nonetheless, it was the first topic that he decided to research after finishing the expedition. His book was published in Leiden, so he could add Chinese characters, which was extremely uncommon. It was considered an authoritative source for many decades. After his return, it was primarily the bronzes, rather than pottery or everyday objects, that received attention in newspaper articles highlighting the installation. And Laufer set out to write a gallery guide. On the right is a corrected galley for the guide. Unfortunately, it was never published. And as Laurel Kendall has recently written, with the change in director at the museum and with Boas no longer there, the administration lost interest in Laufer, his method, and the objects he collected. Kendall reports that the museum even tried to sell the objects to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they declined. Museum guidebooks published the same information and photos year after year, mostly based on what Laufer had prepared in the gallery guide. For example, this photograph of the 100-ring urn repeatedly was used, and it was mislabeled as an ancient object. Even the current exhibition is little changed since I first saw it 20 years ago. Most of the collection still is in storage. The museum has created a database with images of every object that he collected, but the information for each entry is taken directly from Laufer's field notes, with little updating based on recent archaeology. What became of Laufer? Boas helped him find another job, leading an expedition, again of one person, for the Field Museum of Archaeology called the Blackstone. He collected very broadly, but his personal interests moved again towards art and archaeology and to Xian. He worked with Mr. Su yet again and spent far more time in Xian collecting close to 2,000 objects, some quite similar to objects collected for the American Museum, but others indicating that the market in Xian had expanded to accommodate the greater number of buyers. He complains about Japanese being there. Laufer was a voracious publisher, mostly working then on the Field's collection. It seems he had no access to the collection in New York, except that they gave all of the rubbings he collected during the Schiff expedition to the Field Museum. They had no use for them. So that's another indication of their complete disinterest in that collection. At the time of his death in 1934, he was considered one of the most influential sinologists of the early 20th century. Thank you.